Good afternoon, students in 20th century Irish history. I'll be, before I actually begin my lecture for today, I have a few, what shall we say, business items to make you aware of or to repeat. First of all, for you to complete the work of the course and receive what will no doubt be in most cases a robust grade, you have to have fulfilled all of your assignments from week 10 through week 11, week 12, week 13, week 14, week 15, and of course what I'm lecturing today is the material for week 16. So get those in if you're lagging behind. Get those in sooner rather than later. Secondly, you have all received, no doubt, my email listing the substitute for a final examination. And in summary, it's part 1 have 50 points out of the total of 100. You have to write a critical 5-page typewritten discussion of Henry Patterson's book Ireland since 1939. That 5-page comprehensive discussion will be covering not the whole book, but pages 261 through 311. So that's effectively 29, 30, about 60. No, let's see, actually, 29, 30, 40 pages in the Patterson book. You have to go online to get the book if you don't have it in hard copy. And once you sign up for it, it will be, you'll be able to borrow it for 14 days. Then part 2, critical comparative 4-page typewritten essay on the status of Irish Catholicism at the end of the 20th and the beginning of the 21st century. The essay will be based on a thoughtful, critical, well-written reading of Gibney's book, 236 to 244, that's 8 pages in Gibney. And then what I sent you in the mail, a segment of Father Vincent Twomey's book, provocative book, The End of Irish Catholicism, and that involves about 22 pages or so. Let's see, 13, 23, 33. Yeah, about 22 pages in the Twomey book. And then a relatively brief article by Professor Emeritus at Fordham, John McCarthy, The Next Step in the Secularization of Ireland, which appeared in Finnish and Crisis magazine. You've got to submit these essays via email to me no later than midnight Sunday, May 12th, 2020. So again, make it one of your several priorities to address the backlog for the course of the semester requirements, and then finally address the substitute for the final exam. Okay, today I'm going to be looking at the Irish Republic from about 1966 until the beginning of the 21st century, the current century. We begin. In the Republic, the period from 1966 to 1977 was on the whole one of rapidly increasing prosperity. Nevertheless, there were sharp fluctuations. The second economic program was abandoned before completion date of 1970, and a more modest third program, 1969-72, was also abandoned. Both of these developments brought on a sharp slump of 1974-1975, economic slump that hit Ireland as much as it did the rest of the world. Remember, these early years of the 70s saw the West generally, including the U.S., having to deal with a huge spike in oil prices associated with violence in the Middle East. And it should be noted that the average rate of growth through the 60s and 70s was maintained at 4% per year for the following reasons. So in spite of these, somewhat erratic developments within Irish economic life, there were some uplifting developments. A boost in agriculture was given by the entry of the Irish Republic into the European Community in January of 1973. The performance of Irish industry was helped by the dismantling of tariff barriers that made inefficient industry obsolete. And also figured here was the Irish, in the Republic, the Industrial Development Authority, which attracted new firms in those decades, largely foreign, that had a good export market, electronics, chemical goods. Indeed, in the 60s and 70s, the Republic becomes less dependent on the British market. Also in those years, the 60s and 70s, there's rapid social change. The population of the Republic rose dramatically from 2,818,000 to 3,440,000 in 1981. This is remarkable, given the fact that ever since the famine, the Irish population was diminishing. By 1979, almost half of the Irish Republic was under 25 years old. Greater Dublin grew particularly fast. But there was also a change in values. 1966, the book censorship was eased. Laws against contraceptives came under increased attack. Divorce remained illegal, but marital breakdown was increasing. And abortion was not legal, but I think it's fair to say that more Irish women were going to England for abortions. Now, all that being said, the great majority of the population, by the end of the 1970s, still went to Mass on Sundays. But the Irish value system was becoming fragmented. On the one hand, there was still a significant part of the Irish population that was traditionally Catholic in their lives. But growing numbers of Irish were being influenced by ideas from Britain, America, and the continent. Many of those ideas were eroding, were undermining Catholic practice and Catholic respect in the realm of moral questions. Also, an active women's movement was developing during this period. That being said, the Republic continued to have a lower proportion of working women, but the numbers of women in employment numbers were growing, and so we have legislation passed to maintain equality of pay and opportunity. Something else was happening. Television. Remember, we said television in the early 60s. Radio Telefís Éireann came to Ireland. TV continued to tackle controversial questions, especially on the late night show. Irish newspapers were becoming increasingly obsessed with stories critical of the Catholic Church. The reading public was increasingly reading newspapers that published rather biased, if I may say so, investigative journalistic pieces. Now, one area of particularly important change in the 60s and 70s was education. Professor Patrick Lynch headed a team which produced a report, Investment in Education, 1966, which analyzed deficiencies in primary and second level education. The Commission on Higher Education also reported in 1967, and on the basis of those reports, the education minister and civil servants pressed through a series of changes. There was a new primary and post-primary curricula. Many small schools were replaced. But the most sweeping changes took place at the post-primary level. Existing schools there were enlarged or amalgamated. New types of schools were introduced, some vocationally oriented. And a real change was that from 1967, education would be free. Secondary education would be free for the vast majority of pupils. The number of pupils in post-primary education shot up. 143,000 in 1956, 301,000 in 1980, 1981. There were changes in higher education. 1968, Higher Education Authority was established to advise the Minister for Education on allocation of funds. Universities expanded. New institutions were set up to emphasize vocational and technological subjects. The Catholic bishops removed their ban on attendance of Catholics at Trinity College. That was 1970. Now, to be sure, over the decades previously, there were Catholics who had attended Trinity, and the church really didn't come down hard on them, and a good number of them still remained practicing Catholics. But for all of the changes that I've mentioned that were more or less positive, there were changes in this period that were not favorable. Inflation was high, and while most people benefited from prosperity, there was a kind of intractable pool of poverty that characterized maybe 20% or even more of the population, and the rest of the population, the more affluent, 80 or so percent, were growing rather indifferent to the poor. At least that was a question. Crime was increasing, especially in Dublin. Pollution was increasing in rural areas. And there were complaints in Dublin especially of poor postal, bus, telephone services, and endless congestion. Unemployment remained high. It's as in all governments, in the late 20th century, there's change, some for the better, some less productive, all very complex. What about politically? The pace of change politically was less breakneck than in society as a whole. But even there it was considerable. The years 1966 through 77 saw three Tasak, in other words, three prime ministers, and two changes of party or parties in power. Now, the same three parties still dominated the political scene. Fianna Fáil, Dev's party, of course, Fine Gael, come out of the 1920s, the pro-treaty party, and Labour. They dominated the scene. The leadership of the parties, the sort of TDs, deputies, representatives that they sent to Dáil Éireann were, I'd say, better educated, more professional. The parties were better funded. But overall, the parties are more equipped to meet the era of television. And now the period. Let's look at it. Period, politically. The period opened with Lamass, who'd been Dev's successor as Taoiseach, securely in office, having gained an overall majority in the general election in 1965. But then he suddenly announced his retirement. There's a struggle for leadership of the Fianna Fáil party. The initial frontrunners were two young, energetic ministers, Charlie Haughey and George Colley. But the party chose an older man, Jack Lynch, from Cork, as a kind of compromise candidate. Probably the best biography of Jack Lynch was, appropriately titled "Nice Guy, Nice Man." What was Jack Lynch's background? He owed his entry into politics to his prowess in Gaelic athletics. And he's not a hard-driving prime minister. He has to make some hard decisions. But that being said, in October of 1968, the Lynch government, Fianna Fáil government, was defeated in a referendum that centered on the question of whether there should continue to be proportional representation. And the electorate answered rather resoundingly that there should be. What Fianna Fáil wanted to do was to abolish proportional representation. What was the margin of defeat? 60 to 40%. That outcome was widely viewed as the herald of electoral defeat in the next general election, and that took place in June of 1969. That general election to the Dáil. Interestingly enough, the defeat that was expected of Fianna Fáil didn't materialize. Fianna Fáil gained 2 seats. Lynch's position in the party was strengthened, but no sooner had Lynch and his party continued in power, then a crisis erupted, the arms crisis. In April of 1970, customs officers at Dublin Airport seized an arms shipment from the continent destined for use by the IRA in the North. That shipment of arms to the illegal IRA led to criminal prosecutions. Initially, by the way, in May of 1970, Lynch dismissed two of his ministers, Charles Haughey and Neil Blaney, whom he believed were implicated in the dispatch of arms to the IRA in the North. A third minister, Kevin Boland, resigned in protest against Lynch's action, and Blaney and Haughey were arrested on charges of illegally importing arms. Blaney was discharged. Haughey went to trial, was acquitted. Blaney and Boland left Fianna Fáil, but only a handful of deputies followed them. Haughey, and this is very important, Charlie Haughey remained in the party. And in February of 1973, Lynch called a Lynch called a general election. The outcome was interesting. It mirrored political outcomes of the 1950s. In that 1973 election, Fianna Fáil gained votes but lost 6 seats in the Dáil, and that meant that a coalition of Fine Gael and Labour took office. And who was the new Taoiseach, the new Prime Minister? Familiar last name, Liam Cosgrave. He was the son of Cosgrave, who had been president of the Executive Council in the 1920s, William Cosgrave. Now, the new government, the Cosgrave coalition government, had to deal with the economic crisis of 1974-75 and the intensifying violence situation in Northern Ireland. And I might add that by-elections, after the general election, special elections came up, did show the coalition government of Cosgrave maintaining its support. And something else, the redrawing of constituency boundaries was expected to favor it in the next general election. But lo and behold, in the June 1977 general election, Fianna Fáil secured 84 seats in Dáil Éireann, the largest majority ever obtained in an Irish general election. And all the other parties, large and small, only secured 64 seats. How do we account for Fianna Fáil's electoral triumph? Well, when you promise the world in trying times, voters can be, tempted to support you. And what was Fianna Fáil's election package? They were going to abolish the rates or taxes on private dwellings and the road tax on smaller vehicles. If you're in my state of Rhode Island, recent elections to the House of Representatives have shown that a promise to reduce and eventually eliminate the car tax was a game winner. That being said, we have the return of Jack Lynch in 1977. What transpires? There was a brief economic boom, but then new economic pressures. Public expenditures were ballooning up. The trade unions were making sizable demands. And also there was economic pressure associated with the decision of the government, the Irish Republic, to join the European monetary system in 1978-79. There was a strike by postal workers, 1979, and it lasted for months. Be that as it may, the country went into euphoria in October of 1979. We have the visit of newly chosen, first time of all, Polish Pope, Karol Wojtyla, Pope John Paul II. He comes to Ireland. He's greeted by massive crowds, and wonderful masses, mass of more than 1 million in Phoenix Park in Dublin, and masses in Limerick, and at the shrine at Knox in County Mayo. The greeting, might have led one to predict at the time that the way forward for Roman Catholicism in Ireland was very positive. Didn't happen that way. We'll mention some of the reasons why. Catholicism fell out of increasingly favor with sizable parts of the once ardently Catholic community. I might add that when Pope John Paul II left Ireland, he flew to that one-time bastion of Calvinism, you guessed it, to Boston, Massachusetts, and in a pouring rain, he celebrated Mass on the common, where, defectors from hardline Puritanism were hanged, and Catholics were accorded for decades staunch, sizable discrimination. I went to that mass, and in the pouring rain, so great was the enthusiasm here in the States for Pope John Paul II that we went up from Providence by train. Trains were busy ferrying people to Boston. That being said, something interesting happened. Jack Lynch was cast aside by his party, and Charles Haughey, who rose from literally like Lazarus from the political graveyard. Charles Haughey led his first government as TSOC. He was a charismatic figure. That first government would last from 1979 to 1981. In October of 1980, his government engineered a pay agreement. And I should, before I go any further in discussing the Haughey government, I should note that as Jack Lynch was cast to the side by his Fianna Fáil leadership, where did he secure some rest and relaxation? In Providence, Rhode Island. He had a close friend who was teaching philosophy, Rhode Island College, a close friend of mine who had actually taught in Dublin for a time, and we worked out a visit to Providence College for one-time TSOC. Jack Lynch, he came into my classroom in Irish history in Harkentall, and he was most gracious, very, very pleasant. That being said, Northern Ireland was still in the throes of serious bloodletting, as you know. There were meetings between Haughey and newly chosen British Prime Minister, the Iron Lady, Margaret Thatcher. Those meetings did not really accomplish much in the way of a unified approach on the Northern Irish question. And think about it, the Fianna Fáil was a Republican party, a Republican light, of course. Be that as it may, there was a general election in the spring of 1981 that brought to power once again a coalition government, Fianna Fáil, Labour, and some independent deputies under Garrett Fitzgerald. Like Liam Cosgrove, he was part of a family political dynasty. His father had been William Cosgrave's Minister for external affairs in the 1920s. And his father, Desmond Fitzgerald, had actually fought in and survived in the Easter Rising. And interestingly enough, Garrett Fitzgerald's mother was of a Protestant background. And Fitzgerald mounted a crusade for constitutional reform. He wanted to remove that claim for sovereignty of Northern Ireland, for the Republic over Northern Ireland, and he's generally liberal on social issues that were becoming increasingly debated, divorce, even as it turns out, abortion. But the interesting thing is, in the course of that period, there's more, what shall we say, Anglo-Irish contact, discussions about Northern Ireland. Be that as it may, you know what happened beginning in May of 1981. We have the hunger strike of 10 young men, beginning with Bobby Sands, and it didn't augur well for the Anglo-Irish relations. And indeed, in March of 1982, Haughey came back again, and his government lasts not very long, from March of 82 to November of 82. There were disputes with the United Kingdom. You remember the war over the Falkland Islands, where Margaret Thatcher's British government went to war over the occupation of the Falkland Islands, or the Malvinas, as they were called, by the Argentine forces. The Brits won the war. Overwhelmingly, the membership of the European community stood with Thatcher's government, but not Ireland. Irish opinion was clearly pro-Argentine. And you say, why? Why? Well, understand that, among other things, the John Paul Jones of Argentina was a county Mayo man. He had helped the Argentines win their independence. William Brown, mariner, helped Ireland win its independence from Spain in the early 19th centuries. But in that period, you do have some celebratory events. There were a number of celebrations noting the fact that 1982 was the centennial of the birth of two great Irish men, James Joyce, Eamon de Valera. And Irish rugby did very well in that year. And a very fine made-for-TV version of the masterful Thomas Flanagan novel about the rising of 98, the year of the French. Flanagan was an English professor at State University of New York at Stony Brook, State University of New York, yeah. It's a wonderful novel, a splendid historical novel. Flanagan really has a feeling for the and a respect for historical reality. The Year of the French. You can still get it, I would say, online. There was another general election in November of '82 in another coalition government, nevertheless under Fitzgerald. Now, it should be noted that the question of abortion for the first time came up for debate in Ireland. In August of 1982, Mother Teresa came to Dublin. She was massively celebrated. And Mother Teresa had a Dublin connection. Yes, she was a Catholic, brought up in a Catholic family in Albania in the Balkans, but she had entered religious life, and her order had sent her to Dublin in those first years. She then was assigned to India, where she taught mainly rather comfortable Indian girls, but then she was drawn by the plight of the poor and the suffering, and of course literally took to the streets, took the dying off the streets in her godly manner and her saintly manner. And the rest is history. So she comes to Ireland. She urges the Irish to speak for life, to pass legislation protecting the unborn. And the two major parties seem to agree that they didn't favor legalization of abortion. Doyle, though, approved a Fianna Fáil constitutional amendment, and that is what was put before the voters in the referendum of September 7th of 1983, and the pro-life constitutional amendment was resoundingly approved, 841,000 to 416,000. How did it read? It read that the state acknowledges the right to life of the unborn, and with due regard to the equal rights to life of the mother, guarantees in its laws to respect and as far as practicable by its laws to defend and vindicate that right. This was a personal rebuff for Fitzgerald, who didn't support that version of an abortion amendment. It should be noted that several years ago that part of the Constitution was excised by a sizable amount, about 60 plus percent of the electorate voted to in effect legalize abortion in Ireland. Now, what about the 80s and into the 90s? Social and political adjustments to the new realities. There's a profound social changes occurring in the Republic. And again, I declare that television was a catalyst. Telephus Aaron, a late night show. And with so many people in the republics with TV sets and able to pick up British TV, the BBC was a factor in promoting social change. There was a liberalization of cinema censorship. There was so the movies ceased to be, banned. Only the most explicit movies would fall under the ban. There was a limitation of the Censorship of Publications Act, 1967. And just as in the States, talk shows were a big factor in introducing to a large public controversial subjects, very often with those subjects being discussed not only by the host but by guests in terms of liberalization. Who was the Johnny Carson, the Jack Pa, the Jay Leno of late night television talk show in Ireland, Gay Byrne. Although I'm not sure that Gay Byrne was the comedy prince that Johnny Carson was, and Jay Leno would come to be. What about the Church? The post-Vatican II Roman Catholic Church in Ireland underwent the same sort of liturgical and disciplinary changes as the Church did throughout the Roman Catholic world. Mass in English, changes in the celebration. Those went reasonably well in Ireland. There's more of an ecumenical outreach, just as there was here, for example, in the United States. I've also already indicated that Catholics were no longer banned from attendance, banned by the Church from attendance, banned for attendance at Trinity College. There was, interestingly enough, a national referendum on Article 44 in the Constitution. You remember that article, which was a masterpiece of liberalization in so many respects, because in that 1937 Constitution, there was recognition of a number of Protestant denominations and formal recognition of the Jewish community in Ireland. 1937, a time when Jews were under siege in Germany and many other countries. So it's a rather liberal article. Now, what did it proclaim? It didn't proclaim that Catholicism was the state religion of Ireland. It simply said that Catholicism was the faith of the majority of Irish. Some would say, well, with the implication that given that fact that the church ought to occupy a position of privilege. Be that as it may, under pressure emanating from folks who wanted to show the Protestants of Northern Ireland that the Republic was not going to be Rome rule. Under that emphasis, the article was removed from the Republic's Constitution. And it was put to the voters, and they favored the removal. Something else we ought to say, there were presidential visits of note, U.S. presidents, okay?
1 hour. 1 hour.
Okay. In 1963, several months before his assassination, John Kennedy came to Ireland. He was greeted with massive enthusiasm, and he himself, by all accounts, had the time of his life there. Spoke to the Dáil and spoke movingly about the hemorrhaging of the population of Ireland that his own forebears participated in the 19th and into the 20th century, and that his message was, well, that's changing. The people of Ireland were going to be able to stay home. Richard Nixon came to Ireland in 1970. He received a less, what shall we say, enthusiastic reception. Why did he come to Ireland? Because he was part Irish. His forebears were Irish Quakers from Timahu, west of Dublin. In fact, his dog, one of his dogs was Timahu, and there are some mementos of that visit in the Providence College archives, because Jack Brennan, class of '59 at Providence College, who went on to heroic leadership in the Vietnam War. He came to the White House. He was immediately appreciated by President Nixon, and when Nixon resigned in August of 1974, who went with him to San Clemente and was his principal aide, it was Jack Brennan. In fact, a movie was made about it. Movie of, a first-rate movie with Jack, let's see, who played Jack Brennan in the movie Nixon, and David Frost, the English pundit, commentator, and who plays Jack Brennan in the movie, none other than Kevin Bacon. Then in 84, Ronald Reagan, whose own father was of Irish Catholic background, he had been brought up Protestant, but his brother Neil was raised and remained Catholic. Ronald Reagan's ancestry dated back to the early, essentially the famine period. His forebear, Michael Reagan, migrated who married to a Tipperary person as well, a woman. They migrated to England, to Canada, and then finally down to Illinois. And Ron Reagan would be, he would glory in his Irish welcome. His roots were of landless laborer family in Doolas, County Tipperary. Tip. Okay, something else I should mention. We've already, we've noted that Garrett Fitzgerald became TSAC for a second time, and he'll last as the TSAC from 1982 to 1980. Let's see, 87. Very interesting developments occurred in his administration. In regards to Northern Ireland, there was a new island forum, and it took testimony from a variety of folks north and south of the border on what the political and governmental situation of Northern Ireland should be going forward. The proposals that came out of the New Ireland Forum were three in number, and all three were succinctly rejected by Margaret Thatcher. Her answer was, as she described each one, no, no, and no. That being said, rather surprisingly, Fitzgerald, TSAC, and Margaret Thatcher, who had let the hunger strikers die, starved themselves to death. Nevertheless, they concluded an Anglo-Irish agreement, I've already mentioned it, in 1985, and it did allow the Republic a significant presence in a consultative role in the government of Northern Ireland. Ian Paisley and his Unionist flock and the Unionists generally were furious at Thatcher. Also, 1985 saw the foundations of a breakaway from Fianna Fáil, the Progressive Democrats. 1985, one of the key ones was Desmond O'Malley from a prominent political family in Limerick. They wanted to constitute themselves as a robust third party. They became an interesting third party, but never gained what they had ambitions to be. How they differ with Fianna Fáil? Well, they were somewhat more liberal, especially on social issues. Now, in 89, Jorge is going to return to power. His third government, 1989 to 1992. And it's Fianna Fáil that goes into coalition, believe it or not, with none other than the former Fianna Fáil folks of the Progressive Democrats. And then in 92, Fianna Fáil remains in office. The TSAC would become Albert Reynolds from 1992 to 1994. That coalition, that was also a coalition government with Fianna Fáil in coalition with the Labour Party. Okay. Now, 1992 also saw a revisitation of the contentious question of abortion. 1992-93, you had the X case. It was a teenage girl who may have been impregnated by a friend, and an abortion was denied, and there was trouble in her being able to leave Ireland for an abortion. It was twisted by the press in so many respects, but that being said, in a referendum, the electorate voted somewhat more, considerably more liberally than it had voted back in 1983. In the McGivney book, 232, where are we? 232, 34. I'll read here on page 232 in McGivney. In 1992, the so-called X case saw the Irish Supreme Court decide that abortion could be permitted where the life of the mother was in danger. The case in question related to a 14-year-old girl who had become pregnant after being raped. The stance of the court in favor of conditional abortion was supported by 80% of the voters. But there was not a removal of the abortion amendment from the Constitution. As I say, that would come several years ago. And then McGivney, of course, notes the introduction of limited provisions for divorce in 1995, a further marker of change, prompting one prominent, albeit disgruntled, conservative activist to dismiss pro-divorce campaigners as wife-swapping sodomites. But this is a point to keep in mind. At the same time, the moral authority of the Catholic Church was fundamentally damaged from the 1990s onward by revelations about the scale of physical and sexual abuse against children in church-run institutions such as industrial schools, and a succession of high-profile cases. Clerical, they say here pedophilia, not just pedophilia, but little kids, more than that, teenagers, male teenagers, crimes whose impact was magnified in the public eye by the realization that the Church had attempted to cover them up rather than submit its members to the rigors of secular law. Yeah, the same sort of difficulties that arose for Catholicism in the United States at the same time, turn of the century. It should be noted, however, that the press was increasingly and deeply and hatefully anti-Catholic, and they were not always fair-minded in treating any of these social issues. That being said, there was enough blame to cast upon the bishops, particularly, to say that they were the agents of their own undoing in the eyes of the Catholics of Ireland. Also, the 1990s saw Ireland and the EU grow even larger, grow even more powerful, and the Irish continued to support the EU, but there's an increasing brushback against the EU. Interestingly enough, the left-wing, increasingly left-wing and increasingly anti-Catholic Labour Party was not enthusiastic about the EU. They felt it was EU was undermining Irish self-government, the government of the Republic. So it's an interesting dynamic. The early 90s also saw the election of Mary Robinson as president. Now, that was a landmark election in many respects. First of all, presidents under the Constitution of 1937 were supposed to be mostly apolitical. They were like the king and queen in the constitutional monarchy of the United Kingdom. Mary Robinson, whose record before she was voted in on the second round by the voters as president. Her record was extremely left-wing. She was forever challenging in social issues the laws of the Republic. But she was charming in her own way. She came from a Catholic family in Ballina, County Mayo. She would, what impact would she have on the office of the president? Well, she got away, I often said, got away with murder. She became more politically active, and political rivals were unwilling to take her on because there's a recognition that her supporters would say, oh, you're only after her because she's a woman. So she had more or less a free range, a free ride. She served that one term and then became, I think, a head of human rights in the UN. Fascinating figure. She came to Brown. My colleague at Brown University, L. Perry Curtis, brought her, and there was a vast and welcoming assembly for her at Brown. Not surprisingly. It's interesting that the president's position had been held by old men up until that point. What subsequently happened was that her successor as president was another woman, Mary McAleese, who, interestingly enough, grew up in Belfast. She was a Belfast Catholic, and also of a Mary Robinson mind on the kind of left wing in the Catholic Church, but probably not as, certainly not as openly political as Mary Robinson, Mary McAleese. Okay, now, in the time I have remaining here, I'm going to ask you to read carefully the section in McGivney, not McGivney, and the Gibney book from pages 236 to 237. Pay a particular attention to the remarkable demographic transformation that Ireland underwent and continues to undergo to this day. That is to say, in contrast to the Ireland of most of the modern period, certainly the 18th century on, Ireland was a land that was hemorrhaging its people. Now, by virtue of the Celtic Tiger, the robust expansion of the Irish economy, by virtue of that, there was a huge influx of people from within the European Union and without. So great numbers, for example, of Poles, of Estonians, of Nigerians, of people who were coming in under the umbrella, under the protection of membership of their countries in the EU. But there were also great numbers of asylum seekers, and there was a brushback. And so the government really began to crack down on these asylum seekers. But it's interesting to note that of the immigrant streams, too, I've always found them of great interest. Significant numbers of Nigerians were coming in. A good number of them were Catholics who had been converted by, or their families had been converted by Irish missionaries, wonderful Irish missionaries. My wife's second cousin, Mara Tinbane, whose history books of the church in Ireland are in the Providence College Library. He was a missioner in Nigeria, a courageous missioner in Nigeria. After his ordination in 1931 in Newry, but he was a Galway guy who was born in believe it or not, in Woonsocket, Rhode Island, taken by his parents to their native Tuam and raised there as a young Irish lad. He became an IRA man in the struggle for independence, but put down the gun, took up the missile, became a wonderful priest and a great scholar under his mentors at Fordham University. Something else you should note is that the Irish, like so many Americans, the Irish government, the Irish banking system, did themselves in, just as we had the great economic collapse of 1908, 1909, that was triggered by the housing boom, by all sorts of near criminal practices in the banking industries and by virtue of political decisions. Just as we had the collapse, so also the Celtic Tiger was slain by the Irish who were living high off the hog. And by the way, money was easily accessible. Interestingly enough, and a lot of that money that was loaned to the Irish and enabled them to build these McMansions, to build summer homes, to go off to Miami, to swim there, vacation there, and conduct shopping sprees in New York City around Christmas. Where was that money coming from? It was coming from frugal Germans who'd carefully banked their earnings and were willing to loan it to the Irish. But the Celtic Tiger flattened Ireland economically. I think it's fair to say that the Irish conducted themselves in the wake of the failures associated with excessive spending and thoughtless spending, overspending, more than did the Greeks. That is to say, the Greeks were not willing to give up some things to go on into austerity governmentally. The Irish were. The Irish faced up to the reality of the situation, and I think it's fair to say that Ireland, over the last last decade or more, has recovered significantly. I say that, however, as Ireland, along with Europe and our beloved country here, are suffering mightily economically in the throes of the virus. Same sort of prohibitions that were imposed and still are imposed by politicrats here in the States. The same sort of restrictions exist in Ireland and Britain and Spain. And the interesting thing is our family, our son, daughter-in-law, grandchildren, are just being let out of the ruthless lock-in Spain. And our my brother in England is currently in a lockdown mode. He and his wife in Kent. So it's a small world that we live in. That being said, I'm going to again ask you to read carefully that last section, and at this point I bring the curtain down on my formal lecture on Ireland in the 20th century. I'm not sure what the future holds for China, for Ireland. It continues to change. The loss of Catholicity, big time. It's difficult to say what sort of an Irish population it will produce. Does seem that the Irish people still have a sizable, segment who are of a giving, generous mind, but the weakening of the church, I think, rather bodes ill will in so many respects for the future of Ireland as a place that was notable for its generosity, and it's hard to say. It's really hard to say. I detect a certain, and it should be noted that the governments of Ireland in the course of the 20th century, especially in the late 20th century, were not notable for their governmental honesty. Hawley was as corrupt a politician as you would have. And there were others in his camp. So it did seem that for many of the leaders, political leaders of the Irish Republic, living the high life and reaping the bound, reaping the effects of the wholesale corruption, bribery, was what defined them, and in some cases led to their political, the destruction of their political reputation. Charlie Haughey especially comes to mind. At any rate, here we are, we're at the end. I wish you well as you put together your final submissions. Don't hesitate to contact me if you have any questions. And I will be telephoning each of you in the course of the next couple of weeks before the final grade is given, just to have a nice, friendly conversation, not only about the course, but your own life going forward. I thank you again for the privilege of teaching you. You're all fine folks, and I do wish you well, and I'll repeat this when we have our private conversations. Please be careful, be prudent, and God willing, we'll be free of this, not only of the virus, but of the remarkable and not so happy disruption of our individual and community lives. God bless, and we'll get back together again. Thank you.